And welcome to another installment of Research Methods focused on designs. We're going to look at some designs with non-randomization. Some of them can actually be used with randomization, but we're not going to focus on the issues of random versus non-randomization, which, as has been presented before, mostly concerns selection bias. So always bear in mind that with non-randomization, you're going to have issues of selection bias. So we're going to start by looking at some designs which are called single case design. And single case design, you very often will find in special education research, in particular when studying particular types of needs that may be rarely occurring because, or very distinctive for individuals, because in such instances, it's very hard to find a group that is homogeneous enough to study as a group, or even more so, two groups. And also you will have ethical issues if you do find two groups withholding treatment from one group for the purpose of research. So let us assume that you have one student, for instance, with autism disorder. And the way a single case design works is basically through the design element of multiple measurements. So for instance, over, as you see on the x-axis, you may have multiple days or multiple sessions. Let's not consider weeks and months, that wouldn't be appropriate in this case. But on each of, in this case, at the first part left-hand side of the x-axis where it says baseline A1 phase, this would be called an ABAB design, where A's represent no treatment. At the baseline phase, you have 7 occasions of measurement, and your dependent variable is perhaps some kind of unwanted disruption, head banging, spinning, I'm not sure what. I'm not an expert in this area, but it's a disruption that you hope will decrease with the intervention that you plan. So every day for 7 days, a full week, you measure on the frequency of that disruption. And you see that it varies over those 7 time periods. Then you apply your intervention and you see your second group under the B1 phase, and you measure on the same variable, disruption occurrences, and you will also undoubtedly, because we're all human beings, have variability in the measurement. Then you withhold that treatment. So you stop the treatment. You measure again. Here you have a later phase for A2, not sure why. And that's to reestablish a baseline without the intervention. And then you go back and you reapply the intervention and you measure it multiple times, again, 7. Now, what you want to see is whether or not, usually a straight line, what the difference is between a straight line of best fit between the baseline phases is compared to a straight line between the intervention phases. Now, this is actually, modeling a straight line is one thing you can do. There are a lot of different kinds of models. We often do this giving what's called the ocular inspection test, which is we just eyeball it. For an intervention that's just getting a design that's just getting an eyeball test, and there are statistically ornate ways of analyzing these data. An ocular inspection works pretty well. You'll see at the bottom a really good description of all the different ways that you can analyze and implement single case designs. One of those people was a professor I studied with, Joel Levin. Another one, David Rinskoff, is actually at the Graduate Center where he teaches statistics. Shadish is incredibly famous for internal validity and research design. Pratchewell, I know, but I can't remember how, but I don't know him personally. But anyway, if you just inspect this, what you'll see is that there's variation at A1 baseline. And then the disruptive behavior with the intervention goes way down and generally stays down. There's a little blip towards the end, but it goes back down. It's much lower. Then when you withdraw the intervention, generally you go back over to the baseline. Now there's one bump way up, which possibly, if you found this, maybe because you did the similar intervention later with another case that was similar or something, you might find out that this was kind of a rebound effect. All of a sudden the student realized, oh, that intervention's gone, and I'm going to really act out. It could just be tense. But generally speaking, your baseline goes back to where it was before, meaning that the intervention's effect had worn off completely. You re-implement the intervention in B2 and it goes down again. A repeated cycle of this is going to make a pretty strong case that the intervention was effective. What you would really like to see is, with multiple implementations of the intervention, that you would gradually see that the withdrawal of the intervention or the return to baseline, the baseline would get lower and lower, in that the child had internalized the intervention, so it didn't have to be delivered to the child. But this is only going to work in certain cases. The fact that the intervention works is the basic premise of this, and it basically is the child is its own comparison group. And so what you're seeing is a trend of no intervention, high outbursts, intervention low, no intervention high, intervention low, and it becomes a reliable enough pattern that you can make the causal claim that the intervention was cause of the change in the behavior. You can do this at the group level. If you often will see this in medical studies. It works in medical studies, particularly if you have an effect that is not expected to endure. So in this case, the X with a bar through it is the explicit removal of the treatment. And I'm just going to look at the repeated treatment design with the example of an NSAID or pain medication for severe muscle ache. And what you see is you've asked the person, an individual or a group of individuals. In this case, you can have a group of individuals because it's not hard to find a lot of people who have muscular aches, and they're acting as their own controls. So they're measured on their scale of pain, which you've probably seen those scales. How much pain are you in right now? Then they're given the pills. They're measured again. Then they could be measured in the top thing more than once again, so that the pill effect has time to wear off. And then the pill is withheld next time they're in pain. And then you see at O3, okay, so with the withholding of the pill, their pain is back. Now I'm going to administer the medication again. And I'm going to see at O4, this is in the second example, where there's been a second intervention with the pain medication, has the pain gone down again? And what you would expect to see with a short-term treatment, like a simple painkiller, that every time the painkiller is administered, the pain goes down. When it's not administered, the pain returns. And this works quite well for a short-acting treatment where you don't expect durable effects. The time series design is similar to either one of these or to a single case design, except it's kind of it is a naturally occurring intervention. So for instance, there's a famous single case design that's published anyway by a statistician named Gene Glass. That's where you see this graph. That's where the graphic came from. And what you see is in 1967 something, a certain month, the British Road Safety Organization of some kind implemented an act that was about, it was intended to diminish traffic fatalities at night. It had something to do with pub closings. I forget all the details of this, but the purpose is thinking about the design of it. And in fact, in many ways, this wasn't designed. It's the analysis of a naturally occurring, what we call a naturally occurring experiment. The British government did this quasi-experiment where they implemented a law to everybody. So people were acting as their own control over a long period of time. And they looked back a couple of years to 1996 to see the number of fatalities at these periods. And they made some corrections for weather or seasonal variations on the grounds that, I guess, in the winter, there might be more fatalities due to snow. I don't know. So what you see is an abrupt drop in fatalities when the British Road Safety Act was implemented. And really, your analysis of this, the basic analysis is, again, ocular. You look at it, you go, wow, that is such an abrupt drop. Unless something else major happened, like the invention of headlights, then I'm going to have difficulty attributing that drop in fatalities to anything else except the enactment of this road. Now, you do have to look and see if there's anything else that could allow you to make the inference that the British Road Safety Act caused, this is the internal validity of this attribution of cause, that the British Road Safety Act caused this drop in fatalities. But if you can rule out what are called plausible alternative hypotheses that would explain the effect, if you can rule out those, and the only thing you can find that explains the drop in fatalities is the enactment of the Road Safety Act, and you have looked far in the past, then you have a pretty good argument. Now, what you'll notice about this is that after the enactment, fatalities start to climb back up. They never climb up to their level at baseline, but they climb up, which means that people perhaps get accustomed to the act and start to figure out ways around it. But this is what's called a time series design, and it is very much like a single case design, except that it is a naturally occurring intervention rather than an intentional one. You can see that there are a lot of ways that you might see a change. So in the example that we saw with the British Road Safety Act, you're basically seeing this abrupt change in level. Right at the intervention point, in our case, the level of fatalities has gone way down. In this A example, it goes up, but it's an abrupt change in level. There are the other ways that things might happen. A delayed change in level means that it takes a little while for the intervention to have an effect. In that case, perhaps it would be harder to make the claim for causation because maybe other things would have come into place that could explain it. A temporary change in level for a time series interrupted by this change agent would look kind of like what we saw here, which is that there would be a change in level, but it would go back to where it had been before. Actually, example D could be considered a decaying change in level, depending on, how things move forward in the future, which we can't see, which is that at first at the intervention, you have a big change, but it wears off. And there are various other kinds of patterns that you could get. But again, this is all a kind of pattern matching. Classically, it has been analyzed essentially through analysis of the graph of observations. There are other ways to analyze a time series, which are more advanced, but really classically, the test remains pretty much what it has always been, particularly for time series. There are simpler ways to analyze a single case quantitatively. So you could treat the baseline observations as a distribution and take the mean and compare it to the mean of the intervention phase. And that would actually could be a test of significance. So those are designs with multiple observations, only one group or even only a single case, but they are good designs with one group or a single case rather than poor designs. And what makes them good is, first of all, the number of measurements. The number of measurements has to be large, both prior to the intervention, so you have a strong baseline, and after the intervention to argue against chance. And the absence of what are called plausible rival hypotheses, which is anything else could explain the effect. If nothing else can explain the effect, and the intervention is associated with quite apparent changes time and again, then you're going to have the strongest case for making the causal attribution that the intervention caused the change in your outcome. Then I want to make just a couple of final comments about, are there things that you can do in your composition of groups that will approximate randomization without actually being randomization? And these come down essentially to matching and statistical control. And the case of matching can be very simple. So let's say a twin study. And so you take twin 1 into group 1 and the second member of that twin set into group 2. Group 1, group 2, group 1, people are not at all randomly assigned. This is not random assignment. And for instance, if you have taken twins who were separated at birth, there could be a ton of differences between these two groups, even though you match them genetically. You could take a Black 10-year-old boy with a ELA score of proficiency level of 2 and match that to another Black ELA boy with a proficiency score of 2, and then get a Hispanic girl with a proficiency of 1 and a Hispanic girl with a proficiency 1, and compose your two groups so that they had equal numbers of each different profile you'd collected. But those people in each group are still coming in with a ton of background variables that they are not equal on and that could affect the outcomes. So you are only able to match on the variables that you can measure. Only random assignment allows the assumption that the two groups are equal for all reasons besides the intervention you apply. Matching will only kind of quasi-equalize on certain roughly measured variables. And so it really cannot help you overcome the selection claim. So matching is just generally not considered a particularly good approach. Now, there are very sophisticated ways of matching, which we won't go into in this course, but generally they're grouped into what's called propensity score matching. And that allows you to statistically create a matching group based on a lot of background variables. It still has the same problems. It's a better design than simple matching, but it is still a inadequate design for substituting for random assignment. It does not substitute for random assignment. There will always be questions about differences in the two groups. You have to go to considerable lengths to seek out plausible rival hypotheses. And it's at some point I can talk about that. I've done some studies using propensity score matching, but it also requires very large sample sizes, access to a lot of data, and it's statistically somewhat sophisticated. It's more sophisticated than you can achieve with 2 semesters of statistics. And mostly it requires very large groups, particularly a very large pool from which to seek your potential matches, because you want optimal matches, which means you have to screen out a lot of people who are bad matches for your treatment group. You have a treatment group and you're looking for people who are very much like them from like the population pool. The simpler way of quasi-equalizing a treatment group with a comparison condition is to use a statistical control. And this has really got the same problems as matching, is that you can only control for the variables that you've measured. Nonetheless, if you have a nice set of pretests, then you can use these statistical controls. You're not going to make the claim that you have equivalent groups, because what you've done is you have statistically controlled for differences related to the things that you've measured. So let's have an example. you have an intervention intended to change teacher intention to leave the profession. So you have a treatment group and you have another group of first-year teachers. They're not randomly assigned. So before you start the study, you measure everybody, first of all, on their intention to leave or stay in the profession. You also measure them on self-efficacy for teaching. You measure them on whether or not they had a family member who was a teacher. You measure them on their type of certification, alternate versus traditional. You measure them on perspective on caring for students. Let's just leave it at that. Then you administer your treatment and you measure the everyone again on their intention to leave the profession. Now, when you analyze the data, what you do is the first thing you do is you statistically adjust using what's called covariate analysis for all of those things you measured before. Did they have family in teaching? Did they have high or low self-efficacy? Did they already intend to leave? All these different things. And what we say is that in your dependent variable, you then have explained a lot of how much their later intention to leave the profession is already explained by all of that background stuff. So now you have how much do they at the end of treatment or at the end of time intend to leave the profession, given all those other things, given the self-efficacy that they came in with, given the family that they came in with, given all these other things. Now, the only thing left is your treatment. Now, plausible rival hypotheses, there may be other things left that you didn't measure. But with all the information that you've measured, taken statistically out of consideration to explain how much they do or do not want to leave, you now are going to look at whether or not your treatment related to that variation. Are people who receive the treatment less likely to want to leave the profession after all those pre-existing conditions have been statistically controlled for? And that's a pretty nice design in lieu of random assignment. You cannot claim causation to the same extent, but you can make a much stronger claim. It's a quasi-experimental design with a statistical control. In fact, people will recommend that you do these statistical controls even if you have a random design, because you can have differences between groups even with random assignment. But I don't know if you're going to cover statistical controls and covariate analysis. It's usually not covered in the first semester. I doubt it will be covered in the first semester. We may look at it in this class, and it certainly is covered in Stats 2 if I want to make a little sale for it. So I just wanted to bring that in because it's something, covariate analysis is very likely something that you'll see in your literature. And I believe that's the last of what I wanted to cover in this presentation. So thank you again, and I'll see you next time.